I first heard the coughing when I got out of the shower one morning about 2 weeks ago. It was a child's cough. I couldn't pinpoint exactly where it was coming from, but given how there were several families with young children living in the same block of flats, I assumed it must be coming from somewhere outside. It is only now that I understand what the coughing meant. Late night the day after, while lying in bed reading, I heard it again. This time I could clearly hear from where it was coming. Room 201, the flat upstairs, the one that had been empty for the last 3 months. I put my ear to the wall. It was definitely coming from the flat on the second floor. There was another sound too, like a soft whimpering. I'll never forget that sound. My first thought was that a child had somehow gained entry into the flat, perhaps a runaway, or a child had broken in and become injured and was unable to get back out. I decided to investigate the sounds and went upstairs. Before I knocked on the door, I put my ear to it, and as I did so, I became aware of a smell. It smelled like incense, herbal and burning. Also, I could distinctly hear the sound of hurried footsteps moving about from the inside. I knocked on the door. I waited, but there was no reply from within. I put my ear to the door again and found that all the sounds had stopped, including the coughing and whimpering. The smell, however, remained. I knocked again. The second knock was met with the sound of a door slamming shut from somewhere toward the back of the flat. There was definitely someone in there, maybe even more than one person, and based on their response to my prying, they didn't want to reveal themselves. I didn't hear any sounds again after that night, but the next day I called the landlord to report the situation. Squatters. That's what he told me when he came over to check the following night. He hadn't actually been inside the flat when he told me that, but based on experience he could safely assume it was the sound of a squatter I was hearing. But the small child? They must have somehow acquired the keys because the windows were all boarded up from the inside, making entry through them impossible. He went upstairs to check, then came back a few moments later. "Forgot my keys," he said, "but no one's answering. You might have scared them off. Now they know someone knows they're in there. Often the case." He nodded to himself for emphasis. He told me to keep an ear out for any more sounds coming from the flat, then left. I didn't hear the sound of coughing again for another few days, but I was awoken in the middle of the night by the sounds of heavy footsteps on the stairs leading to the second floor, and sounds of heavy objects being dragged across the floor above. It sounded just as if someone had moved in and was unpacking their furniture. I slowly opened my front door and peeped out of the crack, just as I heard the click of the door above me shut. Then silence. Had I just missed them? I crept out the door and the smell hit me instantly. The same herbal incense smell as before, only this time it was stronger, suggesting the door had been open and it wafted out. As I inched my way up the stairs, a sound became more and more audible. It was faint, but unmistakably there. A chime, or maybe a small bell. It rang in a slow rhythm. There were also voices now. It sounded like 3 or 4 people. They were all slowly chanting something. I couldn't catch what language it was, so I moved my ear closer to the door. It was probably the fumes emanating from whatever was burning inside that made me cough. I couldn't help it. I coughed twice. The second cough I was able to catch in the crook of my forearm, muffling it as best I could. Instantly the sounds from inside the flat stopped, and I was frozen to the spot. I didn't know whether to run down the steps or to wait and act casually as one could in the small hours of the morning outside in their pajamas. The silence was then broken by the sound of floorboards creaking inside. Someone was walking across the room and came to a stop just behind the door. Then I felt it. I knew someone was there. They couldn't see me, and I nor them, but there was a sense of mutual recognition of each other's presence. Myself and whoever was behind the door were inches from each other. For some reason, maybe out of panic, all of my senses were heightened, but I could swear I felt that whoever was standing inches away from me did not want me there. It was as if they were challenging me to stay. I backed away, keeping my eyes on the door. I made as little sound as I could as I crept back down the stairs to my door. But just there on the first floor landing, 2 large green eyes stared up at me. It was a cat, one that I'd never seen before. It regarded me for a moment, then indifferently turned and walked outside. The smell of it remained outside my door, a smell which perfectly matched its greasy, matted black fur, like wet soil from the bank of a septic drain. I turned on all the lights in my flat and sat awake in the lounge listening for the rest of the night. Finally, it was 9 o'clock in the morning, and I could call the landlord. "What type of smell?" he asked. His voice was gruff, like he had just woken up with a bad whiskey hangover. "A herbal smell," I replied. "Drugs?" he exclaimed. I told him I wasn't certain. He moaned and said bothersomely, "Fine. I'll be by later to check it out." With that, he hung up. I didn't leave the flat that day. Instead, I spent the whole rest of the day listening intently for any noise outside or from the room above. I drifted in and out of sleep as I sat in the lounge, numbly watching the television. Not out of interest in what was on the screen, but more of a need for company. But the images on the afternoon news did nothing to ease my distress. Another child had gone missing, the reporter said. She was playing in a park near her house when witnesses reported her wandering off in almost a daze into the surrounding woods, leaving her bicycle behind. This was over a week ago, and she still hadn't been found. The images of the grieving parents appealing to the public for information were interrupted by a rapping at my door. I hesitated at first, then heard a familiar voice from the other side of the door. "You all right?" It was the landlord. I traipsed to the door and opened it. "Yes, I'm fine," I told him. He must have been taken aback by my dishevelled appearance, because he eyed me suspiciously. "Haven't heard anything then?" he asked. "Nothing," I replied. He took a ring of keys from his jacket pocket. "Got my keys this time." I smiled weakly and left him to it. After that, I must have passed out due to fatigue, because I never heard back from the landlord as to the result of his visit to the flat upstairs, and my watch read 11 p.m. I tried calling him, but the phone just rang out. Then I heard a scratching sound. It was coming from my front door. It sounded like something was trying to dig its way under the door. As I approached the entranceway, the sound stopped abruptly. I waited, expecting it to start again. I opened the door to find nothing there. Then, as an afterthought, I turned my gaze to the upstairs door. Sitting atop the stairs was a cat, the same cat as I had seen the day before. When I saw it, the smell came with it, that same damp, rotting fur smell. Its muddy green eyes narrowed when they met mine. We looked at each other for a time, waiting for each other to make a move. Then it slowly turned around and lifted its tail, exposing its nether regions. It craned its neck over its shoulder and looked at me. The movement was almost sensual. Its mouth twisted into a grin, exposing teeth that looked far too big for its mouth. The teeth weren't long and pointed like a cat's, but blunt and wide, like baby's teeth. Then a long streak of dark yellow urine hosed from its behind in my direction. Foul specks of acidic-smelling piss landed at my feet. I dodged the rest of the spray behind my open door. It stopped, leaving puddles of vile excrement all over the bottom floor landing. I then looked up and found the cat nowhere to be seen. Its smell, however, remained. I filled a bucket with water from the kitchen and threw it over the stinking piss that had pooled outside my front door. I repeated this process 4 times before the smell was weakened to a tolerable level. Then I left another full bucket next to the door. If the feral beast came back, I wanted to be ready for it. As I was shutting the door, I heard a voice from the other side of the stairs. It was a deep, resonant voice, quiet, calm and cold. "Does the boy like the smell?" it said. Was the voice addressing me? I replied in its direction. "Who is it?" There was no reply. "Is anyone there?" I asked. Then the cat strolled out from behind the corner, stopped, sat down, then started licking itself. I rushed back inside to get the bucket, almost feeling happy for the opportunity to give it a good drenching. But when I turned back around, the cat had gone. "Shit," I cursed. I threw the bucket at the spot where it had been sitting anyway. I glanced up at the door to the flat above me, cursing it silently too. The landlord still wasn't answering his phone, despite my calling him 11 times since I woke up. The voice that spoke to me from behind the stairs and rattled my already raw nerves even further. And that damn cat. With all the unsettling events of the past 24 hours, not to mention those of the last week or so, the flat suddenly felt stifling and oppressive. I needed to get out, even if only for a short time, so I decided to take a walk around the block in the hopes that it might clear my head. There wasn't anyone in the streets that night, thankfully. I kept checking behind me every few minutes or so all the same. I half expected to see that stinking cat trailing me. What the hell were those teeth about anyway? Just the thought of seeing it again sickened me. A junkie was slumped half-conscious in the doorway of a nearby factory. She regarded me with lobotomy eyes, then weakly held out a hand. I pretended not to see her and kept walking. There were a lot of junkie beggars around here. Then from behind me I heard a voice. It was the very same voice that spoke to me from the stairwell in the building. "Does the boy like the smell?" I spun around to face the speaker. The junkie girl I had just passed was sitting bolt upright and facing me. She was grinning and she had the same teeth as the cat. Panic shot through me and bolted me to the pavement. "What?" I said, my voice breaking. She didn't reply, only continued to grin, sitting there stock still, her back straight as a board. In a moment of grim fancy, I mused how sitting there in the murk of the doorway, she looked strikingly similar to the Cheshire Cat from Alice in Wonderland, wide eyes and large teeth glowing in the dark. Her head fell to her chest and she made a low gurgling sound, like she was trying to vomit. Then she flopped lifelessly back into the doorway, as if someone had pressed an off switch on her. At that point I just ran. It was instinctual more than anything. It was in the opposite direction to my flat, but that didn't matter. I had to remove myself from the reality or nightmare I had just seen. I staggered in fatigue back to my building, covered in a cold, clammy film of sweat. Before I go back in, I thought, I'd try the landlord again. I dialed the number with shaky hands. Then I heard it, coming from somewhere upstairs. A mobile phone rang. It was muffled but unmistakable. It was coming from number 201. I pressed cancel and waited, and the ringing stopped. I pressed call again, and sure enough the sound of the ringing again. He's up there, I thought. I ran outside and around to the corner of the building and looked up. Through the cracks in the wooden boarding on the window I could see a light, orange and glowing, flickering as if to suggest candlelight. I needed a ladder. I dashed for the building but tripped over, my phone slipping out of my hand and crashing to the concrete. It landed on its side. The screen was a spider's web of cracks. The home button wouldn't respond when I pressed it desperately. I stuffed it in my jacket pocket and continued running for my room. I ripped open the pantry door and took the fold-up step ladder out. On the way back out, I coughed again uncontrollably from a smell drifting down from upstairs. That foul incense again. It burned this time in my starving lungs. Unfolding the ladder, I placed it carefully against the side of the building, making sure not to extend it too far upward. Just enough so I could see into the room. It took an effort to scale the thin steel steps of the ladder with precision. My body was still shaking with fear and panic. My breath was heaving. I reached the step which would afford me the best view of the inside of room 201 and looked in. Standing around a table in the middle of the room were 4 naked women. 3 of them looked middle-aged, the other very elderly. They were all covered in something. It was a red-black colour and was glistening and smeared up from their groins over their wrinkled bellies and sagging, withered breasts. One was holding a small bell, another holding a mesh sack, the contents of which bulged and made large wet-looking black circles on its surface. The eldest of the 3 was holding something in her hand. I couldn't see exactly what, but from it dangled a string, to the end of which was tied a small hand. A child's hand. It had been severed just above the wrist. Its 2 middle fingers were tied together with thin red string. Lying atop the table they were surrounding was a small body. Its gender was indeterminate, but it was definitely dead. Its feet had been cut off with what looked like surgical precision. The ends of its ankles looked like cold cuts displayed in a butcher's shop. Its hands, too, were missing. Instead, a gnarled tree branch had been inserted into each wrist, making it look like a stick parody of a scarecrow. And a dried pumpkin or gourd with faint indentations of facial features was on its neck in lieu of its head. The 3 women had their heads to their chest, bowed in supplication, as they murmured some chant. Then I looked over to the other side of the room, and just beyond the hallway, it was the landlord's body. He was face down in a pool of thick red ooze. The back of his head sagged inward, the skull turned to gravel. He seemed to have been ambushed. The chanting rose to a crescendo, and the candle lights flickered, momentarily obscuring my vision. But through the flicker of the light, I saw the head, or what had now replaced the head, of the poor dead thing on the table turned towards me with a nightmare slowness. It very slowly, very deliberately started to rise from the table. I pushed away from the window in disgust and shock, landing on the damp cold grass with a thud that knocked me winded. For a short while, I don't know how long, I lay there on the grass, wet with late-night dew, trying to comprehend what I had just seen. Then, like a kaleidoscope of images in my mind, I connected the dots. The coughing of a young girl, that smell of something burning coming from room 201, the whimpering, the missing girl on the evening news, that tiny body on the table, mutilated and sickeningly enhanced, the landlord's murdered corpse to ensure there were no witnesses. Whatever it all meant, it was undoubtedly evil, something I should not have seen. And did I really see the wretched body start to rise above the table of its own accord? I had to alert the police. Having no working phone, I had to make it to the police box on foot. Under normal circumstances, this was a feat that would take 10 minutes, 12 if you took into account the crossing lights. But I staggered to my feet, made for the direction of the police box. I vomited instantly, a thick stew of bile landing on my sneakers. After another few paces, I was nearly across the building's lawn and out onto the main road. I covered my mouth, trying to stop another gushing from up my throat. My hands filled with something warm and slick. It burnt my nostrils. The smell made me sicker. I passed a group of teenagers, one of which was holding a bottle in a brown paper bag. They laughed mockingly at me. "You all right, mate?" The largest and ugliest of them asked, flashing brown baked bean teeth. I pushed past them and stumbled almost blindly down the footpath. I think they yelled something behind me, but I couldn't be sure of what was said. It was followed by another chorus of laughter. When I reached the police box, I was covered in a thick film of sweat and my own vomit. The lone officer inside took pity on me as a drunk and let me lie down as he administered a breath test. The results came back negative. I refused and regained my composure enough to tell him what had happened, what I had seen earlier, what felt like hours earlier. He believed me and scrambled for backup. I could do no more. The building was ablaze with the blaring lights of police vehicles. Officers stood around on their radios, and a few passers-by stood watching and muttering amongst themselves. 2 officers led me to room 201, in which more police were gathered. There was a large blue sheet covering the spot where the landlord's body was, but the rest of the room was empty, save for that smell of rotting herbal incense. The officer who I talked to at the station looked mystified. "You said you saw—" he began. "Yes," I said. There was nothing in the room. No table, no evidence of anyone except the landlord having ever been there. He shone his torch on the floor to reveal 4 dark red splotches. They weren't random stains. If you traced a line joining them at each dot, you would see a rectangle. The legs of a table, as if something had run down each leg, making an imprint on the floorboards. "We think it's blood," he said. "Is this where you saw the table?" I nodded. He then shone his torch up at the ceiling. There was a large black circle drawn on the ceiling. A single straight line, drawn in something dark red, ran through it from north to south. "Does this mean anything to you?" he asked solemnly. I shook my head. "Forensics will take a sample of all this soon and see if it matches anything else related to the disappearances," he added. This did little to relieve me. He led me back outside and into the stairwell. "We will be taking a full official written testimony from you soon, as you understand. But was there anything else you remember?" he said, taking out his notepad. I had already told him about the various noises and smells, and recalled as best I could what I saw through the window. Then I remembered one detail I had neglected. "There was a cat," I said. "A cat?" "Yes, a black cat. I had never seen it before the noises started." He scribbled something in his notepad. "This cat," he began, "may have belonged to whoever was occupying room 201? I sighed, and he jotted something else down. "Thank you very much, sir," he said. "We will need to take an official statement now if you're able, so you'll have to accompany me back down to the station." He looked me over again. There was pity in his eyes. "But you may take a shower and change clothes, of course." I did so, and accompanied him and 2 other rather intimidating officers back to the station. The landlord's death was ruled as homicide, blunt force trauma to the back of the head, resulting in massive cerebral hemorrhaging. No suspect had been made, and as far as I know still remains unsolved. I've not seen anything in the news about it. My testimony of events was met with suspicion more than anything. This is probably due to the fact that there was no tangible evidence of what I had seen, except for some dried blood on the floor. DNA testing had been inconclusive, and what was later labelled graffiti on the ceiling. I'm moving out of this flat in a few days. I don't suspect I'll be getting much rest until then. In the dead of the night, I sometimes hear the sound of cats fighting and crying, and sometimes it's very quiet, like right now. I can hear soft, small, padded footsteps outside my door. I live in a fairly quiet country town near Brighton, in the south of England. The type of town whose local newspaper publishes stories about the town's oldest cat finally dying, or a 2-page spread about how Mrs. Cobb won the baking competition for the 5th year in a row. It could be any small town in the UK. So it came as no surprise when the local papers and radio stations all simultaneously blew up with the news that last week another person had been hit and killed by a car on Norton's Road. Freakish pedestrian accidents aren't unheard of in any part of the world, but here, and along the same stretch of road, 4 people have been killed in the last year and a half. When one takes these things into account, and how the testimonies of all the drivers revealing that they never saw anyone on the road before hitting them, one can only be forgiven into thinking that there is some other force at work. Having experienced something there myself recently, I can definitely subscribe to that notion, and I consider myself very lucky to even be here typing this story. The road is quite long, about 10 kilometres. There are a few gentle curbs and an incline or two, but otherwise it's structurally safe and good, considering its age. I walk to and from work, crossing this road as I do, and it's only very rarely that I would see more than 2 or 3 cars using it. I work in a warehouse for a cross-country logistics firm, taking inventory, pick-packing, loading and unloading produce, all very menial. December is my month to be on the night shift. We rotate the night shifts every month. I cross Norton's Road at around 7 p.m. and then again on the way back home at just after 4 a.m. Apart from the physical discomfort of the freezing early morning temperatures, the disturbed sleep patterns can take its toll mentally. As I was crossing the road on the way back home one morning, I felt a pressure around my neck when I was halfway across. It was my scarf. It felt as if it were being pulled from behind. I yanked it back and turned around. There was only a slight breeze, making the long grass at the side shimmer silver and white. Then the same sensation, this time being pulled from the other side of the road. It was almost as if any step I would take in the direction was countered by a pulling of my scarf in the opposite direction. I ripped the scarf off my neck and hurriedly crossed the road, making it to the other side just as a car sped past. At the time I put this down to mental fatigue the night shifts had inflicted on me. That and the recent media coverage of the accidents along the road must have aroused my imagination. I put it out of my mind and returned home. The very next morning I crossed at the same place on my way home. I took 2, maybe 3 steps out onto the road, when all of a sudden I felt very dizzy, like I was drunk. My head felt extremely heavy and groggy and threatened to topple me forward if I leant over too far. Then I tripped on something. I fell face first onto my hands and knees, still very disorientated. I remember smelling the wet early morning dew that covered the road. I felt so heavy, I couldn't push myself back up. I thought I must be having a stroke or something. I could crawl though, so I sluggishly crawled on my elbows and knees towards the other side. Then I was blinded by a bright light coming from my side. High beam headlights. An instant after, the roaring of an engine, then the deafening screech of hard rubber on asphalt. The car surged to an awkward stop within about 6 feet of where I was. "Idiot!" the driver yelled out of his window. "Get a taxi if you're too pissed to walk." He then muttered something about the owner of the local pub and drove off, leaving me at the side of the road in shock. I no longer felt dizzy and could stand once on the other side, but as soon as my senses returned, a wave of nausea and terror rolled over me, and I vomited all over the ground. One way or another, I managed to drag myself back home. I was absent from work the next day with a vicious fever and slept for most of the day and night. The following day I went back to work. I put the events of the past few days down to fatigue and felt that with the passing of my exhaustion I was able to resume my regular schedule. That morning after my shift, again I crossed the road. I stepped out into it feeling fine, got halfway across feeling nothing out of the ordinary. A few paces from the edge, something wrenched my left ankle out from under me. The grip was like a vice. I fell flat onto my face. Then I was dragged backwards along the ground. I clawed at the road as I could taste blood in my mouth from the impact. I turned to look at my feet and saw a hand attached to my left ankle, and that's all I saw. A hand and part of its forearm. I say that's all I saw because just before the elbow, the rest of the arm faded into transparency. It was disembodied. It was grey, sinewy and muscular. A man's arm. I kicked at it and wriggled my leg with all the force of my panic, but its grip didn't waver. It stopped pulling once it dragged me to the middle of the road. Then the sound of an approaching engine. I kicked at the arm with my free leg. It was like kicking a piece of concrete. I could see the headlights getting brighter, the motor getting louder. I pulled myself upward and clawed at the arm. It was like ice, cold and hard. Flailing both my arms and screaming, I tried to make myself as noticeable as possible to the oncoming car. Mercifully, it braked and skidded onto the gravel, the horn blaring the whole time. Then there was silence, only the soft hum of the engine and a peculiar ticking sound coming from under the car. My ankle was released and my leg flopped to the ground. The driver of the car, a middle-aged woman, burst out of the driver's side door and ran over to me. She lifted my head and said something to me, then pulled out her phone from her jacket pocket. After that I must have passed out, because when I woke up I was in a hospital bed. Over the next week or so, my friend, who was also my co-worker at the warehouse, came to visit me every day. I told him everything that I had experienced in its entirety since I crossed the road that morning and felt my scarf being pulled. He said he believed me, but he said it with a look of pity. "Tell you what," he said, "I'll go there myself on the way home and see what happens, yeah?" I warned him not to, but he said he had to go, if only just to put my mind to rest. He didn't come to visit me for 2 days after that, and when I called work, they told me he hasn't come in. From my hospital bed, I kept an eye on the TV news and checked the papers, but there was nothing concerning an accident on that road. I have been hoping every day since that he will turn up. The desert is a scary place for me now. It used to be a place filled with peace and serenity, but since living out there for almost 30 years, you see things. This occurrence took place in the high desert of California in the mid-90s. The whole town was once all military. There is a military plant there and a prison, so the streets, even to this day, consist of numbers and letters. For example, Avenue O and 178th Street. You always heard stories of people going missing and about underground tunnels, which were later confirmed. A friend of mine would keep feeling a draft coming from his closet in his childhood home, and later, after he'd grown up, he checked it out and found an opening to one of these such tunnels. He called me over to check it out, but after I got there and we went through the opening, I was too freaked out to go more than 10 feet in. When I turned around, I told him that this might be how people disappear. You always see things late at night off in the distance, fast past the lights of that then small town. Strange glowing lights that shot straight up, and things in the sky, just stuff you never talked about. Life was pretty carefree back then. If you wanted to visit friends though, you would have to drive down long desert roads and sometimes end up coming home late at night in the pitch black because there were no streetlights. I remember coming home late one night with my boyfriend at the time and another friend, and we pulled over for some reason. Something compelled me to get out of the car and look up at the stars. We were in the middle of nowhere, but we could see what sounded like machinery and muffled clanks like from metal. We all started looking around but didn't see anything, when just then we felt a vibration under our feet. I crouched down on the street and put my ear to the ground. It was coming from under us. We all listened intently and heard voices far down, but couldn't make out what was being said. We all stood up and were discussing what it might have been, when we saw a small red light on the horizon, and it was getting closer. We piled into the car and got out of Dodge. We only told a few friends about this incident, and they'd experienced the same thing. A year later, I told a friend about a small hauling business that I had started, and there was a big job, so I needed to borrow a trailer. He said he had a few I could use, so I should come out to his property to check them out. Whilst I was there, it was just starting to get dark, and he pulled out a new toy of his. It was a pair of military-grade night vision binoculars. He told me to wait until it got dark to leave because he wanted to show me something creepy. I was all in. Later, we walked towards the back of his property, looking out at nothing. No lights and no roads. Nothing but barren desert. He pointed the binoculars east, and oh my, there were people out there, coming out of the ground and moving around. I said, What the hell am I looking at? And he told me his family called them the ground dwellers, and that they are located in various parts of the desert. It gave me the heebie-jeebies. Needless to say, I never went to his house after dark again. At one point, we were living in a mobile home park past Avenue F. There was a huge treehouse in my yard left by the former renter, and the only way to get up into it was a hole that was cut into the floor with a door on it, and under that was a rope ladder. One night I was sitting on the porch drinking a cup of tea when I heard something move up in the treehouse. I looked up when a head suddenly popped up. It was a lady and her husband hiding. Clearly I thought they were on drugs. I told them to come down from there, but they didn't want to. It wasn't until I threatened to call the authorities did they cautiously comply, looking all around, not wanting to be seen. By now there is a small group of my friends and nosy neighbours gathering around. I saw that she was terrified by something, so I asked them to come in and I made them something to eat and waited for her to calm down. She pulled out these papers. There were drawings and schematics. They looked like legal documents with a government letterhead. Some of them had embossed seals, and they had smoke damage, with a few of them even burnt on the edges. She told me that they were checking out this place of Barrel Springs Road. There were 2 or 3 cinder block structures there. I knew them well. A few years back I happened upon that place, and when I did, a black truck rushed down to greet me with guns drawn. She said the same thing happened to her, but she was in one of the structures, so she grabbed some things, and her husband ran. I went over these pages and felt very uneasy reading them, like this was stuff people get killed over if got out. Stupidly I said, "Why don't you just simply give them back?" She said they had been running everywhere, until they stopped, and a black car or van with government plates showed up and sat there watching them. I really didn't want to get too involved, especially after reading what I had. It was too big for little me, and I will take what I saw to my death. So I packed them a lunch and told them they could sleep in the treehouse for the night. They did so, but they were gone early the next morning. After that we started seeing black vans parked on our lonely road facing the house. At one point I even went up to one of them, but they took off as soon as I knocked on their blacked-out driver's window. Lots of other unexplained things happened out there in the desert. You don't see much of it now, though. I think maybe because there are more lights and people. Well-lit towns and camera phones are pointing everywhere nowadays, and there weren't cell phones to call for help back then. I remember one time a few years later, it was a fun day, as some friends and I were in this stupid little red car called a Yugo that seemed to be on its last legs most of the time. My friend's uncle told him that there was a whole abandoned town far west of the Mojave Desert, and there were things just left there all over the place. We were so dumb. It took us a long time to get out there, and if you asked me to try and find it now, I don't know if I could. I wasn't driving, not that I would ever want to. Thinking we were lost a few times, we started seeing things. A carnival ticket booth on a trailer, broken tractors and furniture, little shacks here and there, and empty water bottles everywhere. There wasn't a store or place of business for many, many miles. I wondered how anyone could even survive in a place like this, and then we saw it. It was long and looked like a single, wide, mobile home, if you could ever call it a home. It was between 60 to 80 feet long, and it was raised with the siding going all the way to the ground. It looked like something from a horror movie. It had windows lined all the way along the front of the house, with old frayed curtains still hung up and blowing in the desert breeze. There were open sections of missing siding, exposing the darkness under the house. There were dusty cars with their doors and trunks open cans and trash all over the place, and a small fire pit in the middle of all of this. His girlfriend and I saw people that seemed not to be wearing any clothes, but their bodies weren't like ours. They were inside that house, and were watching us from the windows and from the open spaces under the house. They were following us as we were driving the length of it, and as we slowly drove past, they went from window to window and space under the house to space. They were almost inhuman. They had big eyes and pale skin, too pale for the desert. He pulled up next to the fire pit, and despite us screaming to go, 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 he turned off the car. His girlfriend began to cry out that we have to leave now. He hadn't seen what we had, and he said, "Stop, babe, this stuff is cool." Oh my gosh, I wanted to punch him in the face. We both kept looking at the people watching us while begging him to get back in the car. He picked up a long bone and was moving the soot around in the fire pit and said, "It looks like somebody cooked a dog." Just then he looked up as his girlfriend leaned over to the driver's seat and grabbed his jacket and started to pull. He'd finally seen what we were seeing and said, "Oh shit." The thing under the house was swaying back and forth with its hands on both sides of the opening in the siding. It was staring at us almost with intent to lunge. My friend's fiancé tried to start the car, but it failed. Thinking that this is my end, eaten in the desert, I started to beat on the back of his seat, screaming, "Please, God, start." After 3 tries it started and we tore out of there, leaving a cloud of dust. We pulled up over far from that location and tried to compose ourselves. Never again, never again. We didn't talk about what we'd seen after that. I think we were all in disbelief it had even happened. There were so many things that occurred in the desert back in the day. Too many to even come close to tell you. There are things we do not, or maybe never, will understand. The Pacific Northwest is a place of wonder, and where we believe creatures of lore exist, as there have been too many various sightings here. I wouldn't say they were demonic in nature, more like tangible beings. The skies are vast, the air is clean, and there is a mystic feeling here, almost as if when you turn a corner you might see a fairy. We never want to live anywhere else. I have been renting a farm-style house with my 2 grandchildren, my son, and his fiancée for almost 3 years now. We have a well under the back half of the house and a pump house behind us. There are around 10 acres of land looking out towards Mount Rainier, and we have a 2-car garage connected to a big workshop, and next to us is a forest. All the things I will be describing have been spread out since we have lived on this property. Sometimes we hear screams coming from the forest, and all the wildlife becomes still and quiet. Occasionally we've listened to what sounds like a metal chair scraping on a concrete floor that echoes in the distance over our land. I talked to the young man and his brother who currently live on the same lot, but closer to the forest, and they told me that they hear it too, but they stay in after dark because it feels like they are being watched. They all think that there is something off with this land. His brother also shared with us that he sees a demon boy, as he put it, in his room and other places in the house. I asked him why he calls him a demon, to which he replied, "Because he scares me and messes with my stuff." I really don't think it is a demon, but what he saw and what we saw in our house will be for another time to tell. As for the noises in the forest, I have compared these sounds to various wildlife indigenous to the area, but found nothing. This particular incident happened when we first moved here on this property that is surrounded by farms. One late night I was driving down the lonely road home, lit only by a handful of streetlights, when I saw a flash of eyes in the distance. Not wanting to hit what I thought might be a deer, I slowed down. When I arrived at the point to where I thought it was gone, but the side of the headlights shined on something greyish-white, and I noticed something almost the size of a man crawling into the bushes. I saw its back muscles and shoulder blades and its back leg. There was no fur, no tail, and no feathers, just a light-coloured, muscular creature. I quickly turned the corner, hoping to see it crawl out over the train tracks on the other side of the bushes, but it wasn't there, so I just went home. Now I know what I saw. My headlights shined on it. I will try to compile all that we have seen in these last 3 years. We know there is something going on with this land. My 2 adult children, my son's fiancée and I have all seen a tall white creature. It stands about 7 feet tall with large eyes peeking around the workshop, just revealing its head, chest, shoulder, arm, with his hand on the wall, and part of its foot. Or it just peeks into the garage window. We have seen this on many occasions, and a few times from my son's window upstairs. My daughter was here for a visit once. She thought she'd dropped something earlier out back when she was playing with the kids in the yard. It was dark, so she and my son went out there and they both flashed lights to find whatever it was she'd dropped. They were searching for quite a while when they suddenly heard something rustling in the tall grass beyond them. She shined her light in the direction of the noise, and standing tall, there in the field, was that same creature. They both ran like hell back to the house. She later moved out of state, and it's been over a year since this happened, so before I wrote this, I gave her a call. I didn't want to lead the conversation, so I simply asked her what she remembered. She described that thing to a T, and went on by telling me about the time she saw it on the roof of the garage, where both awnings meet. She'd stepped out of the front porch, and something caught her eye over the garage. She stepped closer, and it tilted its head. My daughter then turned to tell her brother to look, and when she looked back, it was gone. Then of course she had to ask me, "Don't you remember me telling you, and you thought I was on drugs or something?" I do remember that, and I apologized. I don't think this or these things have ill intent, or at least I would hope not. It's just scary. One early evening, my son and his fiancée were leaving the garage from the side door, and my son locked eyes with this same thing crouched on all fours on a lawn couch outside my bedroom window. He said it was white with pasty skin and had a long neck and big round eyes that almost glowed. Its head stayed fixed on him, and straight, but moved up and around clockwise and back like it was sizing them up like an owl. It was crouched with knees, but it was not an owl. My son then started pushing his girl faster to the house. It was a while before he went back out there, and never alone, or never at night. And just to let you know, we have never seen a raccoon or squirrel on this property. Another time I was on my front porch one evening. I let the dogs out one last time before bed, and noticed that they were all acting skittish. They all did their thing, and then piled up in front of the door with crazy eyes, as if they wanted in now. Thinking it might be coyotes, I let them in and went to the end of the porch to see what frightened them. I keep a light on above my back door, and another one further down on another area of the back of the house. Something was tall enough to block out the light casting its shadow on the wall of the garage. It couldn't have been a giant moth on the light, because the shadow was cast by both lights. That gave me the creeps to think that something was standing right outside my back door. My granddaughter keeps her window blinds shut after dark, even though there is no one around. She said she feels uneasy. We are not living in fear by any means. It's just different, you know? This hasn't been an everyday occurrence, but it's enough to take notice. I have no explanation as to what this is. At first I blew it off, thinking that it was just some sort of wildlife we didn't know about before. But after seeing these things for almost 3 years and getting validation from others, I know that it is so much more. Maybe someday before we move, and I ever get my hands on some proper camera equipment with night vision, I will share my findings. Hey fearsome friends, thanks for listening. Please make sure you subscribe and click that notification button so you can be aware of all my videos when they upload. If you have a story that you'd like to hear me record, then please send it to my subreddit, rmissfearsome83, or alternatively email me at missfearsome83@hotmail.com. If you'd also like to support me further, please go to my Patreon and join for as little as $1 a month, where you'll get early access to all my recordings, and they will also be available as MP3 downloads. I also have some awesome merch on the Spreadshirt website. All links are in the description below. Stay safe, stay happy, and remember, keep being creepy.